Hello and welcome to my channel. How are you all? I hope you're having a great evening. Today I'm going to tell you a wonderful story, a true, historic event retold as a story. First, please take 30 seconds to subscribe. And if you leave a comment saying which country you're watching from, it makes me happy to know where my viewers are from. Thank you in advance. And I wish you everyone a good night. If you're ready, let's get started. Itakaha Haha not seen its king in 19 years, and the great hall of his palace had become a battlefield fought without swords. Inside those stone walls, more than 100 men ate at another man's table, drank another man's wine, and courted another man's wife. Jerd 10th, the Odysseus, Lord of Odysseus, Lord of Ithaca, Sacer of Troy, was dead somewhere beneath a foreign sea. His son Telemachus had grown from an infant in his mother's arms into a young man of 20. And for as long as he could remember, his home had belonged to strangers. He walked its corridors like a guest in his own life, watching the suitors slaughter his family's cattle and swine for their feasts, watching them insult the memory of a father he could barely recall, and swallowing his fury because he did not yet know how to be a king. His mother, Penelope, held the palace together through nothing but her wit. For years, she would choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law, Laers, and for years she had unpicked by night what she had woven been by day, buying time with thread and patience. But patience, even hers, was wearing thin, and the suitors were growing bolder, some of them now whispering of murdering Telemachus outright, so that none would stand between them and the throne. It was into this simmering house that a stranger arrived one morning at the gates. A traveler with sharp eyes and a spear in hand, though no one in that hall knew they were looking at a goddess. Athena, born the she-sheep of a family friend, an old sailor named Mentis, to walk unnoticed among mortals and set in motion what the gods themselves had finally agreed upon. On Olympus, the council of the gods have turned its attention back to Odysseus after years of silence. All of them moved to pity except one. Poseidon, god of the sea, who nursed a grudge against the man that no other god shared, a fury born from an injury done to his son. While Poseidon was away, feasting among a distant people, Zeus had allowed the other gods to act, and Athena had asked to be the one to go. She loved Odysseus for his cunning, the same quality that made him her favorite among mortal men, and she could not bear to watch his son wither in a hall full of parasites, while his wife starved on false hope. Telemachus received the disguised goddess with the courtesy his upbringing demanded, even in a house he no longer controlled, and over a meal interrupted by the suitors' laughter and lyre music, he confessed everything: his grief, his helplessness, his suspicion that his father truly was dead, since no man could survive so long apart from home unless the gods themselves willed his ruin. Athena, in the voice of Mentis, told him otherwise. She said that Odysseus was not dead, but held prisoner on a distant island by a sea nymph, that the story of his death was nothing but rumor dressed as fact, and that a man of his cunning would find his way home eventually, whatever chains the gods or the ocean placed on him. Then she gave Telemachus his first command and, as a man, ran rather than a boy. Sail out from Ithaca, seek news of his father, from the old warriors who had fought beside him at Troy and survived the journey home, and, upon his return, deal with the suitors as a king's son should, whether through cunning or through force. She vanished as suddenly as she had come, leaving Telemach changed. For the first time, he stood taller in his own hall. That night he announced to the suitors that he intended to call an assembly of the Island's men at dawn, and the following morning, standing before the gathered citizens of Ithaca, of Haka, who had not convened in council since his father sailed Troy 2 decades earlier, he spoke with a boldness startled even himself. He accused the suitors openly of devouring his household and insulting his family's honor, and he begged the elders present to intervene, though he already suspected what they'd.
But their silence would confirm that no one wished to cross so many powerful young noblemen at once. The suitors mocked him in return, one of them, Antinous, laughing off the accusation and blaming Penelope's endless delays for their prolonged occupation of the hall, arguing that she had strung along her suitors for years and deserved whatever came of it. Another suitor, Eurymachus, added his own scorn, demanding to know who the strange visitor was that Telemachus had entertained the day before, unaware that he was king, asking after odd. The assembly broke apart, with nothing resolved, but Telemachus had not called it to win an argument. He had called it to be seen and heard as a man willing to act. And now, with Athena's counsel fresh in his mind, he began preparing in secret to leave the island in search of his father's fate, gathering a crew, readying a ship, asking his old nurse Euryclea to provision it with wine and grain, without revealing his plans to his mother, whom he feared would try to stop him out of love rather than doubt. Athena, watching over him herself now, as Telemachus himself, to gather sailors through the town, and by the time the moon rose that night, a ship stood ready at the harbor, crewed and provisioned, prepared to slip away before the suitors could learn of it and set an ambush. Telemachus boarded in secrecy, poured a libation to Athena as she had instructed, and set sail across the dark water toward Pylos, the kingdom of the aged warrior Nestor, The first man he hoped might tell him something true about his father's fate. The wind Athena sent behind his sail was strong and favorable, and the ship cut through the sea through the night, while Telemachus and his small crew kept watch over the rigging. The young man's heart caught somewhere between fear and the strange news of command. He had never before been trusted with anything larger than his own grief. Now he carried the fate of his household with him across open water, sailing toward men who had stood beside his father in the last, bloodiest years of the Trojan War. Men might finally tell him whether Odysseus was alive, drowned, or wandering still, unable to find his way home. Part 2. The Kings Who Remembered. Pylos greeted Telemachus with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of hundreds of voices raised in sacrifice to Poseidon. For old King Nestor was holding a festival on the beach when the young man's ship and the Yenship arrived. And it was into this crowd of feasting strangers that Telemachus had to walk uncertain and unannounced to ask after his father. Athena, still disguised as mentor, urged him forward, reminding him that boldness was the only currency that mattered. And Nestor received him with the warm, talkative hospitality of a man who had outlived nearly everyone he loved and treasured any excuse to speak of old days. He was the oldest of the Greek commanders who had sailed to Troy, a man who had ruled three generations of his own people. And his memory of the war was long, detailed, and heavy with grief for the friends it had cost him. He told Telemachus of the war's ending,
of the wooden horse and the burning of the city, and of the terrible quarrel that split the victorious Greek commanders apart eaward ever for they could sail home, a rift between Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus so bitter that the fleet divided in half. Ships leaving at once, and others staying behind to appease the gods with further sacrifice. Nestor had left early, and so had Odysseus, or so he believed, though the two of them had parted ways not long after, and Nestor had heard nothing certain of him since. He spoke instead, with visibly reluctance, of Agamemnon's own homecoming, murdered in his own palace by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover the moment he set foot on Greek soil, and of how Agamemnon's son, Orestes, had later avenged his father by killing the murderers himself, a story pointedly as a lesson. A son who acts to defend his father's house wins honor that lasts forever, and Telemachus, sitting across from him, understood exactly whom the tale was meant for. Nestor could not tell him where Odysseus was, only that he had vanished from the general knowledge of the returning Greeks, somewhere after Troy, and he urged the young man to travel further to Sparta, where King Menelaus himself had only recently returned home after years of wandering the eastern seas, and might have heard something more he sent his own son, Pisistratus, to accompany Telemachus by chariot overland to Sparta, and Athena, her purpose here accomplished, slipped away from the company entirely, transforming into an eagle, and vanishing into the sky before the astonished eyes of everyone at the feast, confirming to Nestor, beyond any doubt, that his young guest walked under the protection of the gods themselves. The journey Sparta took Telemachus and Pisistratus across the width of the Peloponnese, and they arrived at Menelaus's palace in the middle of a double wedding-fitting feast, his son and daughter both being married on the same joyous day. Menelaus welcomed the two young travelers without knowing yet who one of them was, and it was his wife, Helen, whose face had launched the very war that had scattered so many families across the earth, who recognized in Telemachus' features the unmistakable resemblance of Odysseus, and named him. Before he had spoken his own name aloud, the mention of Odysseus turned the wedding feast somber, and Menelaus wept openly for the friend he assumed he would never see again, recalling the sharpest of all his memories from the war, the trick of the wooden horse, which Odysseus had devised and then herself, and which Helen herself, she still seemed ashamed of, had nearly exposed by imitating the voices of the hidden soldiers' wives outside the horse, tempting them to answer and give themselves away. And it was Odysseus, above all others crouched inside that darkness, who had kept the men silent and saved them all. The following day, once the feast had quieted, Menelaus finally told Telemachus what he knew, a story stranger than anything Nestor could offer. On his own long and troubled voyage home, driven far off course by the gods for toiling to honor them properly after the war, Menelaus had found himself stranded on the island of Pharos off the coast of Egypt, unable to catch a wind home, until a sea nymph took pity on him and bit him and told him how to capture her father, the shape-shifting old sea god Proteus, who alone could answer any question put to him if a man was strong enough to hold onto him through his transformations into lion, serpent, and flame. Menelaus had done exactly, wrestling the god through every shape he took until Proteus surrendered and answered his questions. And among the things Proteus told him was word of Odysseus, that he was alive, but trapped, weeping on an island far across the sea, held against his will by the nymph Calypso, who loved him and would not let him go, and who possessed no ship, no crew, and no means by which he could ever sail home on his own. For Telemachus, it was the confirmation he had crossed the sea to find. His father was not dead. He was a prisoner of love and geography both. Alive somewhere beyond reach, and the news settled in Telemachus with a mixture of relief and fresh anguish, because knowing his father lived and knowing he could do nothing to bring him home were two very different kinds of pain. Menelaus urged him to stay longer as an honored guest, but far away on Ithaca, danger was already gathering. The suitors, humiliated and enraged that Telemachus had slipped past them to sail off in secret, had learned of his voyage, and, fearing what alliances he might return with, set an ambush of their own, positioning a ship in the strait between Ithaca and the neighboring island of Same, prepared to kill him the moment he sailed home. Part 3. The Man Who Wept on the Shore. While his son crossed the mainland searching for word of him, Odysseus himself sat on a beach on the island of Ogygia, exactly where Proteus had said he would be, staring out at a sea that had kept him a prisoner for 7 long years. Ogygia belonged to the nymph Calypso, whose name meant the one who conceals. And it suited her perfectly, for she had pulled Odysseus from the wreckage of his last ship and nursed him back to health, fallen in love with him, and then simply refused to let him go, offering him immortality itself if only he would stay by her side forever and forget his home, his wife, and his son. It was, by any measure, a paradise. Caves draped in soft veins, meadows of violets, birdsong, an immortal lover who wanted nothing more than his happiness. And still, every day, Odysseus walked to the shore and wept, staring toward a horizon that held nothing but water, aching for a rocky, unremarkable island that could never compare to Ogygia in beauty, but which was his, and which held everything he had ever actually wanted. It was this scene that Athena described to the assembled gods on Olympus, seizing the moment of Poseidon's absence to make her case plainly, that a man of such loyalty and suffering deserving better eternal imprisonment by a nymph's affection, and that it was time, finally, for the gods to let him go. Zeus agreed, and dispatched swift messenger of the gods, to fly down to Ogygia and deliver the command directly to Calypso herself, that she release her captive and help him build a raft to leave her island for good. Calypso raged at the unfairness of it, protesting that the male gods always resented any goddess who dared to love a mortal man while indulging their own countless affairs freely. But she was not foolish enough to defeat Zeus outright, and she went to find Odysseus on the shore to tell him he was finally free to leave. He did not believe her at first, suspecting some cruel trick after 7 years of hope worn down to nothing, and made her swear a formal oath before he trusted the news. But once convinced, he worked for 4 days straight, felling trees and lashing timbers, to build the small raft that would carry him back into open water. Calypso, true to her word despite her grief, supplied him with wine, food, water, and a favorable wind, and watched him sail away from her shore, likely for the last time in either of their long lives. For 17 days, the raft held steady beneath calm skies. Odysseus, never once closing his eyes fully, using the stars, exactly as Calypso had taught him, to keep his course toward home. But Poseidon, turning at last from his distant feast, and finding his enemy loose upon the very sea he ruled, would not let the crossing go unpunished. He summoned a storm of extraordinary violence, driving winds friends from every direction at once, waves that broke his raft into splinters, and cast Odysseus into the churning water, certain now that he had drowned the man who had once blinded his son. Odysseus survived only through the intervention of another sea goddess, Ino, who took pity on him amid the wreckage and gave him a veil that would keep him from drowning if he abandoned the broken raft and swam for it, and for it. Through 2 days and nights of relentless swimming by the very sea. He had once commanded a fleet across. Odysseus finally washed ashore, naked, exhausted, and utterly alone, on the coast on an unknown land called Scheria, home as to a seafaring known as the Phaeacians. He crawled beneath a pile of leaves near the mouth of a river and collapsed into a sleep so deep it was nearly death itself. And it was there that Athena intervened once more. This time through a dream sent to a young princess named Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian King Alcinous, urging her to go. Wash her family's linens at the river the following morning in preparation for her own eventual wedding, though she had no husband yet in mind. Nausicaa woke and convinced her father to lend her a wagon and her attendant maids. And the group spent then their morning washing clothes and playing games on the river bank, laughing loudly enough that the noise finally roused the exhausted, half-starved man sleeping nearby beneath his pile of leaves. Odysseus woke to the sound of young women's voices and faced an immediate and delicate crisis. He had no clothes, no strength, and no standing among these strangers. Yet he needed their help to survive. Every maid but Nausicaa fled in fright at the sight of the wild, sea-bothered stranger emerging from the brush. But the princess held her ground, and Odysseus, calling on every ounce of the diplomatic cunning that had made him famous amongst the Greeks, addressed her with careful, respectful flattery, comparing her beauty to that of a young palm tree he had once seen growing besides a sacred altar, and asking humbly for clothing and directions, rather than demanding anything at all. Nausicaa was moved by his composure, despite his condition, gave him clothes, food, and oil to wash with, and recognizing that walking into the city beside a strange man might invite gossip about her own reputation, instructed him to follow at a distance, and to seek out her mother inside the palace, since it was Arit, more than King Alcinous himself, whose favor determined how any guest was received in that court. Part 4. The Stranger Who Wept at the Song. Odysseus followed the princess's instructions exactly, cloaked in mist by Athena, so that he could walk through the city unnoticed, until the moment he chose to reveal himself. And when he entered the great hall of Alcinous, and knelt before Queen Arieta as a suppliant, the mist dissolved, and the entire court stared in astonishment at the sudden appearance of a stranger in their midst. He told them nothing yet of his name or his home, only that he needed passage across the sea. And the Phaeacians, a people famed above all others for their unmatched ships, and their sacred duty of hospitality to travelers, agreed at once to help him, promising a vessel and a crew to carry him wherever he wished to go, once proper feasting and honor had been given first. At the feast that followed, a blind court poet named Demodocus sang of the Trojan War, and among the stories he chose, seemingly by chance, though the gods may have guided his hand, was the tale of the wooden horse and the fall of Troy itself, the very trick that Odysseus had devised. As the blind singer's voice filled the hall with the story of his own greatest triumph, could not stop himself from weeping, pulling his cloak over his face to hide the tears from his hosts, and though he managed to conceal his grief through most of the song, King Alcinous noticed his distress, ever perceptive, called for the games and feasting pause, so that his hidden sorrow might be addressed directly. Young Phaeacian nobles mocked the strange for declining to join their athletic contests, assuming a man who refused to compete must be some soft merchant rather other than a warrior. And the insult finally provoked Odysseus into action. He rose, seized the largest discus in the ring without even removing his cloak, and hurled it farther than any throw the Phaeacians had ever witnessed, silencing every doubt about his character in a single motion. This display, more than anything else, that pushed Odysseus toward finally revealing who he truly was. And when Demodocus sang once more, this time of the Trojan horse's darkest night, Odysseus wept up again, openly this time, and Alcinous, watching him, gently asked the question that Hall had been wondering. Who was this stranger? Where was he from? And what sorrows made him weep at songs of a war for a decade before? Odysseus lifted his head and answered plainly. He was Odysseus, son of Laertus, king of Ithaca, a man known throughout the world for his cunning, and the story of how he came to wash up broken and alone on their shore was long, painful, and stranger than anything the blind poet had yet sung. That night, the hall fell utterly silent, every Phaeacian noble and servant leaning forward to hear the tale of the man whose wooden horse had ended a 10-year war, and Odysseus, gathering himself, began to speak of everything that had happened to him since he had sailed away from the smoking ruins of Troy. Story that would consume the entire remainder of that long night. Part 5. The Cave of the One-Eyed Giant. He told them first of the Cicons, a people allied with Troy, whose coastal city his 12 ships had raided on the way home, a raid that began in easy victory and plunder, but ended in disaster when his men, against his orders, lingered too long feasting on the spoils, instead of returning to the ships, giving the Cicons time to summon reinforcements from inland and strike down, selling several of his men, and forcing the rest to sea. A bitter first lesson that even a war already won could still cost him blood on the way home. Storms then drew of his fleet far off its intended course, around the dangerous Cape of Malea and out into unfamiliar waters entirely. And it was here that his men first encountered the Lotus Eaters, a gentle, peaceful people who lived on an island where a certain flowering purine grew, one that induced in anyone who tasted it a total, blissful forgetting of home, family, and any desire to leave at all. Several of Odysseus's scouts ate the lotus and fell instantly into that trance of contentment, weeping when Odysseus forced them back to the ships and had them bound to the rowing benches, hauling them away by force from a paradise of forgetting that would otherwise have ended their journey then and there, swallowed not by violence, but by peace itself. From there, they sailed on to the land of the Cyclopes, a race of lawless, one-eyed giants who lived without government, without agriculture, and without any regard for the customs that bound civilized men together. Each Cyclops content to rule over his own household and ignore his neighbors entirely. Odysseus, driven by the same curiosity that so often proved both his greatest strength and his deepest flaw, took one ship and a small band of his best men, meant to explore a cave they found stocked full of cheese, milk, and penned livestock, ending against the advice of his own crew to wait and meet whoever lived there, rather than simply take the food and leave, hoping for a gift befitting the ancient laws of hospitality. The owner of the cave returned that evening. Polyphemus, a cyclops of monstrous size, son of Poseidon himself, who sealed the cave's entrance behind him with a boulder so massive that no combination of ordinary men could ever have moved it, trapping Odysseus and his crew inside with him. When Odysseus explained who they were and appealed to the sacred laws of hospitality that should have obliged Polyphemus to feed and shelter them, the giant answered with contempt, declaring that the Cyclopes cared nothing for the gods or their laws, and then, without warning, seized two of Odysseus's men dashed them against the cave floor, and devoured them raw before the horrified eyes of their companions, before falling asleep, satisfied, across the cave's entrance. Odysseus considered killing the giant in his sleep, but caught himself in time, realizing that only Polyphemus possessed the strength to move the boulder blocking their only exit, and that killing him would only condemn the survivors to a slow death sealed inside the cave forever. He forced himself to wait, and watched Polyphemus, a Polyphemus, devour two more men for breakfast the next morning, before driving his flocks out, posture, and sealing the cave behind him. Trapped for another full day, Odysseus devised plan, sharpening a massive wooden stake from an olive trunk left in the cave, hardening its point in the fire, and hiding it away until the giant returned that evening, killed two more of his men for dinner, and settled down to drink the strong, undiluted wine that Odysseus offered him as a gift, a wine so potent it was normally mixed heavily with water before drinking. Polyphemus, delighted by the wine and demanding more, asked his guest's name in return for the gift, and Odysseus answered with the lie that would become the centerpiece of his escape. His name, he said, was Nobody. Amused, Polyphemus promised that in exchange for such a fine gift, he would eat Nobody last of all his companions, and then collapsed into a drunken sleep. Odysseus and his remaining men heated the sharpened stake in the fire until it glowed, and drove it directly into the giant's single eye, twisting it as blood hissed, and giant's scream of agony echoed through the hills, bringing his fellow Cyclopes running to his cave, ask what was wrong. When they called through the sealed entrance, asking who had hurt him, Polyphemus answered honestly that nobody was hurting him, and his neighbors, hearing this, concluded that no one was attacking him at all, and that his pain must be some private matter between him and the gods, and left him alone. Teucriphage, blind and desperate to catch his tormentors, Polyphemus rolled the boulder aside the next morning to let his flock of rams out to pasture, running his hands over the back of each animal as it passed to make sure no man was riding out on top of one to escape. But Odysseus had already anticipated exactly this, and had bound his men in threes beneath the bellies of the largest rams, hidden from the giant's groping hands, with Odysseus himself clinging to the underside of the largest ram in the flock, the giant's own favorite, which Polyphemus paused to speak to tenderly, wondering aloud why it walked so slowly today, unaware. One final act of pride that would cost him dearly. As his men rowed hard away from Nigh Island, he shouted back toward the shore, taunting Polyphemus and revealing his true name at last, unable to bear the thought that his cleverness might go unrecognized. Polyphemus, hearing this, tore the peak from a mountain and hurled it toward the sound of his voice, nearly capsizing the ship. And then, in fury and grief, prayed aloud to his father Poseidon, asking that if Odysseus was as ever fated to return home, he should return late, alone, having lost all his men, and find nothing but ruin waiting for him there. Poseidon, hearing his son's curse, granted it in full, and from that moment on, the god of the sea became not merely an obstacle in Odysseus' path home, but his personal, relentless. Part 6. The Bag of Winds and the Witch of Aeaea. Their next landfall brought better fortune, at least at first. The floating island belonged to Aeolus, keeper of the winds, a king favored by the gods with the power to command every gust and gale in the world, and he welcomed Odysseus warmly for an entire month, listening with fascination to the story of the fallen city of Troy. When it came time for his guest to leave, Aeolus gave him an extraordinary parting gift, a leather bag in which he had bound every contrary wind in the world, leaving only one gentle western breeze that would carry Odysseus' ships directly home to Ithaca. And he warned him sternly never to open the bag under any circumstances. For 9 days that breeze carried them steadily onward. Ithaca itself finally visible on the horizon, close enough that Odysseus, exhausted from personally tending the sail without rest for over a week, allowed himself to finally sleep. It was in that mood of weakness that his own crew undid him, convinced that the bag contained hidden treasure that their captain meant to keep for himself. His men opened it while he slept, and every imprisoned storm wind burst free at once, driving the ships backward across the entire distance they had just sailed, all the way back to Aeolus' island, in sight of home one moment and hurled cruelly away from it the next. When Odysseus returned to beg for help a second time, Aeolus refused outright, declaring that any man so clearly hated by the gods was no one he wished to help again, and turned him away for good. Grief and exhaustion followed them to the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants, far more numerous and organized than the solitary Cyclops had been. Odysseus, weary after Polyphemus, kept his own ship anchored outside the harbor, while the rest of his fleet sailed into what looked like a sheltered bay. And it was Cauthys' caution, and it was this caution alone that saved him. For the Laestrygonians revealed themselves to be monstrous dress giants who hurled boulders down from cliffs onto the trap ships, smashing them to pieces and spearing the drowning sailors like fish for their table. 11 of Odysseus' 12 ships were destroyed in minutes, along with every man aboard them, and only his own ship still anchored safely outside the harbor, managed to escape, leaving him with a single vessel and a single crew from the fleet that had numbered 12 full ships when he sailed from Troy. It was this small, a shattered remnant of his command, that finally reached the island of Aeaea, home to the sorceress Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios, a being of immense magical power who lived alone in a great stone house at the center of the island, surrounded by wolves and mountain lions that, strangely, showed no aggression toward visitors at all. Odysseus split his remaining men into two groups to explore the island, and the group, led by his trusted officer, Eurylochus, discovered Circe's house, drawn in by the sound of her beautiful singing as she wove at her loom. She invited them inside and fed them a feast laced with drugs. And the moment they had eaten, she struck each man with her wand and transformed them instantly into swine, penning them with the rest of her enchanted animals, their minds left horribly intact within their new bodies, even as their forms became beasts. Only Eurylochus, who had stayed outside the house out of caution, escaped the spell, and he ran back to warn Odysseus of what had happened to the others. Odysseus set out alone to confront the witch and free his men, and along the way, the god Hermes appeared before him and gave him a rare protective herb called moly, which would shield him from Circe's magic, along with careful instructions for how to overcome her once her spell failed to work. Odysseus followed the instructions. He ate the meal she offered, felt her wand strike him without effect. And when she realized with astonishment that her magic had failed against him, he drew his sword, as Hermes had told him to, and forced her to swear a solemn oath she would do him no further harm before finally sharing her bare bed. She pleaded with him to do one power meeting another and finding, unexpectedly, something like mutual respect between them. Circe restored his transformed men to their human shapes, apologized, and offered the entire remaining crew her hospitality for as long as they wished to stay. That stay, no offer its stretch in the end, into a full year of feasting and rest on her island, a year Odysseus's men would later remember as the last true crew comfort they ever knew, and one that Odysseus himself allowed to run far longer than perhaps he should have, worn down by grief and glad, if of only for a season, his burdens down. Part 7, The Land of the Dead. It was his own men who finally reminded Odysseus that Ithaca still waited for him, and when he asked Circe for passage home at last, she told him something that no traveler wished to hear. Before he could return, he first had to sail to the edge of the world, to the house of Hades, spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias, the only soul in the underworld, who could tell him what he still needed to know to survive the journey ahead. She gave him careful instructions for the ritual required, and though the request struck horror into his men, they sailed, as she directed, until they reached the shore of ocean itself, at the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Following Circe's ritual exactly, Odysseus dug a pit, poured offerings of honey, milk, wine, and into the earth, and sacrificed a black ram, and ewe over it, letting their blood pool in the trench, and the moment the blood touched the ground, the spirits of the dead rose from the depths in Ephes. Great swarming crowd, drawn by the scent of blood, and desperate for even a taste of it, seed, since only through blood could the shades of the dead briefly regain enough substance to speak. Odysseus drew his sword and held the desperate crowd of ghosts back from the pit until Tiresias himself arrived to drink first. The prophet's spirit warned him of dangers still ahead, chief among them a warning that would echo through everything that followed. That when his ship reached the island of Trinacia, he must under no circumstances allow his men to harm the sacred cattle of the sun, sungwood Helios, grazing there, for if they did, every one of them, but Odysseus himself, would die before ever seeing home again, and even Odysseus, if he survived at all, would return to Ithaca late, alone, in a stranger ship, and find his household in ruins. Tiresias also foretold, more gently, that after he had finally reclaimed his home and dealt with the men who had wronged him there, this time would need to travel once more, inland this time, carrying an oar on his shoulder until he met a people who had never seen the sea and the sea and mistook the oar farmer's winnowing tool, and there he was to plant it in the earth and make peace with Poseidon at last at Lorth, before finally being granted, after everything, a long and peaceful old age. Having received the prophecy he came for, Odysseus allowed other spirits to drink from the blood and speak with him as well, and among them came his own mother, Anticleia, whom he had not known, was dead until that very moment, having died of grief during his long absence. And he wept as he tried 3 times to embrace her ghost, his arms closing on empty each time, since no living hand could hold what belonged to the dead. She told him of the state he had left behind, his father Lartus, living in poverty and sorrow on a rural farm, refusing all comfort. His wife, Penelope, weeping through the nights, but still faithful. His son, growing up in a house he could not control. Other great spirits came forward as well, women of legendary lineage and heroines of ancient stories. And then the shade of Agamemnon himself, murdered in his own home upon his return from Troy, who warned Odysseus bitterly never to trust a wife completely, in a good one since his own had. Betrayed him utterly, though he was quick to note that Penelope's loyalty and cleverness set her heart apart from his own faithless queen, and that poets would sing of her virtue forever because of it. The spirit of Aeschylus appeared too, and when Odysseus tried to console him by praising honor and glory he now held among the dead, Aeschylus rejected the comfort entirely, declaring that he would rather be a living slave, serving the poorest forest farmer on earth than a king over all the dead. A line that struck Odysseus harder than almost anything else he heard in that gray and joyless place, undercutting every notion that death in glory was any kind of victory at all. The spirit of Ajax, still refusing to speak to him even in death, furious over an old rivalry between them for the armor of the fallen Achilles, that Ajax had lost and never forgiven, and further still, the great sinners of old myth, Sisyphus endlessly rolling his boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down again for eternity, and Tantalus forever reaching for fruit and water that pulled away from him the instant he moved to touch them. Punishments so vivid and so endless that Odysseus finally understood the full weight of what defying the gods could cost a soul, even after death itself. When the crowd of countless dead pressing toward the blood pit grew too great and too frightening even for him to endure any longer, Odysseus retreated at last to his ship, and sailed back from the edge of the world toward the world of the living, carrying with him a prophecy that told him exactly how his journey would end, if only he could survive long enough to see it through. Part 8. The Song of the Sirens and the Monsters the Strait. Jers welcomed him back to Iowa one final time to bury a crewman who had died in a fall, and to hear, in careful detail, everything that still lay ahead of him before he reached open water toward home. She warned him first of the sirens, creatures whose song was so beautiful that no sailor who heard it could resist steering toward them, only to wreck upon the rocks where the bones of countless previous victims lay, piled in evidence of the song's fatal power. She told him exactly how to survive them, to plug his crew's ears with beeswax so they could not hear a single gull note, and if he himself wished to hear the forbidden song and live to tell of it, to have his men bind him tightly to the mast and refuse his orders to be freed, no matter how desperately he begged it once the singing began. Odysseus followed her instructions to the letter, and as his ship passed Sorrent's land, their voices reached him alone, calling to him by name, promising him a knowledge everything that had happened in the world, flattering him as the greatest of all Greek heroes. And the song struck something so deep in him that he strained against his ropes and screamed at his crew to release him. But his men, ears sealed with wax, and following his own earlier orders, exactly only rowed harder and bound him tighter, until the island faded behind them, and the fatal song grew faint, and finally silent. Gyr's had warned him next of a stretch of narrow water on either side by two monsters, and no route existed that avoided both entirely. On one side loomed Scylla, a six-headed creature living in a cave halfway up a sheer cliff, each of her heads capable of snatching a man clean off the deck of any ship that sailed too close beneath her. And on the other side churned Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallowed the entire sea 3 times a day and sput it back out again, capable of dragging an entire ship and all its crew down into the depths at once if it sailed too near. Zeus advised him plainly that losing 6 men to Scylla was a far smaller price than losing the whole ship to Charybdis, and told him not even to attempt fighting the 6-headed monster, since any time spent fighting would only cost him more men in the end. Odysseus, unable to bring himself to warn his crew fully of what awaited them, steered his ship as close to Scylla's side of the strait as he dared, and watched in helpless horror as her 6 heads darted down and snatched 6 of his best remaining men straight off the deck, their screams calling out to him even as the monster carried them off to her cave to be devoured. The single most agonizing moment of the entire voyage, he later confessed. Worse even than anything he had witnessed at Troy, because he watched it happen and could do absolutely nothing to stop it. Grieving and diminished, the surviving crew reached the island of Trinacia, sacred pasture of the sun god's cattle, exactly where Tiresias's prophecy had warned him never to let his men cause harm. Odysseus wanted to sail past entirely without landing, but his exhausted crew begged for rest, and Eurylochus argued so persuasively for a single night's respite at Odysseus' Relin, expecting a solemn oath from every man that none of them would touch the sacred herds. For unruly winds trapped them on the island, their food supplies dwindling to nothing, until one day, while Odysseus slept, hunger finally overpowered the men's restraint, and Eurylochus convinced them that starving to death while surrounded by fat cadet was worse any god's punishment, and they slaughtered several of the sacred animals to eat. Odysseus woke to the smell of roasting meat and understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. The god Helios, discovering the slaughter of his sacred herd, complained to Zeus and threatened to take the sun itself down to the underworld and shine it among the dead forever if he was not avenged. And Zeus promised to destroy the offending ship the moment it left harbor. When favorable winds finally returned and the crew set sail once more, Zeus made good on his word, summoning a storm that shattered the mast and hull alike, hurling every last man into the sea to drown. sparing, honoring only Odysseus himself, who clung to broken wreckage and drifted for 9 days before finally washing ashore, exactly as Tiresias had foretold, at the one place in the entire wide ocean, where his suffering could still somehow continue, the island of the nymph Calypso, who took him in, fell in love with him, and held him there for 7 years, precisely where his story to the Phaeacian court had, in a sense, already ended, and where the tale he now finished telling had, at its true beginning. First, Part 9, The Ship That Sailed by Thought Alone. The great hall of Alcinous had listened to this entire story in silence, and when Odysseus finished, no one doubted it any longer who he was or why he wept at songs of Troy. King Alcinous, true to the promise made before he even knew his guest's name, ordered his finest ship prepared at once, crewed by the most skilled Phaeacian sailors alive, whose vessels needed no pilot and no rudder at all, since they could sense thence their destination by thought, and carry any passenger there through night and fog, without ever losing their way. The court loaded the ship, gifts of gold, bronze, and fine woven cloth, far more treasure than Odysseus had carried even at the height of his plundering after Troy. And that night, exhausted from the telling of his own long ordeal, he fell into the deepest sleep he had known in 20 years. While the ship carried him, silent and swift, across the final stretch of sea between him and home, they reached Ithaca before dawn, and the sailors, careful not to wake him, carried Odysseus ashore still sleeping, laid him, gentle mien, on the sand, along with all his treasure hidden safely in a nearby cave, and sailed away again before he ever opened his eyes. But their kindness came at a terrible cost. Poseidon, still nursing his grudge and furious that the Phaeacians had ferried his enemy home, despite every obstacle he had placed in the man's path, complained to Zeus, who allowed him one final act of vengeance, as the Phaeacian ship sailed back into its own harbor in full view of its home city. Poseidon turned it to solid stone in an instant, crew and all, and threatened to seal the Phoenicians' own harbor forever behind a mountain, unless they abandoned forever their ancient custom of ferrying every lost traveler safely home, a punishment that would haunt that generous seafaring people for the rest of their days. The price paid, indirectly, flee. For Odysseus' own long-delayed homecoming, Odysseus woke on the beach with no memory of how he had gotten there, and in a moment of bitter irony, after everything he had survived, he did not even recognize as his own homeland. So long had he been away, and so thoroughly had the years worn down his memory of its shape. It was Athena, appearing before him now not in disguise, but in her own form, who revealed to him where he truly stood, and who laughed with something like genuine admiration. at his instinctive first reaction. Rather than weeping with joy, Odysseus immediately began inventing a false identity and a false history to protect himself, unwilling to trust even his own senses, until he understood exactly what dangers awaited him. A habit of caution, so deeply ingrained in him, after 20 years of hardship, Athena declared no mortal alive could out-scheme him, not even a god would, without enjoying the challenge first. She told him plainly what he already feared. His palace was overrun with suitors devouring his household. His wife's loyalty had held only through the thinnest of threads. And his son had grown into a one while facing threats, even now against his own life. Athena disguised Odysseus as an elderly, ragged beggar, withering his skin, graying his hair, and dulling his once famous eyes, so that he could move through his own kingdom entirely unrecognized, while he and his son, once reunited, planned how to reclaim the household by force. She sent him first, not to the palace itself, but to the hut of his loyal swineherd, Eumaeus, a man who had served the royal household faithfully for decades, and who, without recognizing his own king beneath the beggar's rags, offered him warm hospitality anyway. Cursed the suitors bitterly for their greed, and spoke with real grief of the master he still believed might someday return, never suspecting that the very man he was defending sat across the fire from him at that very moment. Part 10. Father and Son. While Odysseus settled into Eumaeus' hut, Telemachus was sailing home from Sparta, unaware that the suitors' ambush waited for him in the strait. And it was Athena, once again, who intervened, warning him through a vision to avoid the harbor, where the ambush lay, and land instead on a different, safe fare, part of the coast, near enough to Eumaeus' hut, that he made his way there directly, rather than risking the main road, where spies for the suitors might spot him. When Telemachus arrived at the swineherd's hut, Athena briefly transformed armed Odysseus back into his true form, and the recognition between father and son, delayed for 20 years by war and the sea, and the will of vengeful gods, finally happened in the humble surroundings of a pig farmer's hutter. The Anipolis Hall. Telemachus at first refused to believe what stood before him, certain that only a god could appear and vanish so suddenly. But Odysseus insisted, weeping that he was no god, but simply a father who had suffered greatly to return to his son. And the two men embraced and wept together, the years of grief and helplessness pouring out of both of them at once. Once the shock passed, they began planning in earnest how to reclaim the household. Odysseus explained that Telemachus must return to the palace first, alone, and endure the suitors' insults a little longer, without revealing anything, while Odysseus himself would follow later, still disguised as the beggar to observe the situation firsthand and judge which of the household's servants remained loyal and which had betrayed him during his long absence. They agreed on a signal. When the moment came to strike, Odysseus would have Athena remove every weapon from the great hall under some pretext, leaving the suitors unarmed against the vengeance about to fall on them. Telemachus returned to the palace first, and Penelope, hearing that her son was safely home, after the terror of learning of the suitors' planned ambush, wept with relief, and questioned him eagerly for any news of his father, though Telemus, following the plan, revealed nothing yet ought he now knew. The suitors, furious that their ambush had failed, and Telemachus had somehow slipped past them entirely, argued openly in the hall about whether to try to kill him now that he was home. But Penelope's fierce condemnation of the plot, once she overheard it, along with the caution of a few suitors who feared the gods' judgment, kept the murder from happening, at least for the moment. The following day, Odysseus, still male disguised, made his own way toward the palace on foot, guided the way by Eumaeus, and along the road they encountered the Gothard Melanthius, one of the few servants who had thrown in his lot entirely with the suitors, and kicked old beggar without the faintest suspicion of who he truly was. Part 11. The beggar in his own hall. At the edge of his own courtyard, Odysseus experienced a moment of quiet heartbreak that had nothing to do with the suitors at all. Lying neglected on a heap of dung near the gate, where it was Argos, the hunting dog he had raised and trained himself as a puppy 20 years earlier, before every sailing for Troy. Now old, free-ridden, and abandoned by every servant in the household, except for the recognition that flickered unmistakably in the old dog's eyes the moment his true master passed by in disguise. Argos raised his head, thumped his tail weakly, and then, having waited 2 decades simply to see Odysseus come home one final time, closed his eyes and died on the spot, and Odysseus, unable to risk revealing himself with even a single tear, had to look away and walk on into the hall, as though a stranger had meant nothing to him at all. Inside, the suitors carried on exactly as they had for years, feasting on stolen livestock, and mocking anyone who dared to interrupt their comfort. And the disguised Odysseus, begging quietly for scraps of food, as any poor traveler might, was met mostly with casual cruelty, particularly arrogant Antinous, who hurled a footstool at him simply for asking too persistently for bread. An act of open cruelty that shocked even some of the other suitors and drew murmurs of Eumaeus, since striking a beggar under any roof risked offending Zeus himself, who was said to watch over travelers, and The poor in disguise, exactly as Odysseus himself, now literally, was. Penelope, hearing of the incident and troubled by it, asked to speak with the strange traveler herself, hoping he might carry some news of her husband from his supposed travels. And that evening, Odysseus sat before his own wife for the first time in 20 years without her recognizing him at all. He told her a careful, invented story of a Cretan king who had once hosted Odysseus on his way to Troy, weaving in true, specific details of his own life and an appearance that convinced Penelope the stranger was telling the truth, and assured her that Odysseus was alive and would return home very soon, even within the current lunar cycle. Penelope, moved and cautiously hopeful despite years of disappointment, ordered her old nurse Euryclea to wash the traveler's feet as a guest's do. And it's during this simple act of hospitality that disaster nearly struck the entire plan. Euryclea, running her hands over the beggar's leg, recognized an old scar above his knee, a wound Odysseus had received as a young man from a boar's tusk during a hunting trek with his grandfather, and she gasped aloud in shock, nearly crying out his name before Odysseus seized her by the throat and begged her in a desperate whisper to keep his secret, which she swore to do, weeping silently as she finished washing the feet of the king she had nursed as an infant. Penelope, absorbed in her own troubled thoughts and unaware of what just nearly happened beside her, spoke to the disguised Odysseus of a dream she had recently had of an eagle swooping down to kill 20 geese in her courtyard, before speaking to her in a human voice at Sering self. Odysseus, come home to destroy the suitors, and Odysseus, still in disguise, assured her the dream meant exactly what it appeared to mean. Then, in words that would set the entire conclusion of the story in motion, Penelope announced her decision at last. The following day, she would hold a contest among her suitors, offering her hand in marriage to whichever man could string her husband's great hunting bow and shoot a single arrow cleanly through the aligned handle holes of 12 axes set in a row, a feat that only Odysseus himself had ever accomplished, and when she privately suspected none of the suitors crowding her hall could ever manage. Part 12. The Contest of the Bow. Morning brought the entire household, servants and suitors alike, into the great hall to witness the contest that would decide Penelope's fate, and Telemachus, in on the plan now, set up the 12 axes himself with careful precision, testing his own strength against the bow first, half hoping in a flash of youthful pride that he might string it himself, and end the contest before it began, failing 3 times before his father, watching sullenly from his base bar's disguise, signaled him with a subtle glance to step back and let the suitors try their own luck instead. One by one, the most powerful and arrogant men in the hall took up the great bow and failed to bend it even slightly, some of them warming the wood over a fire first in a futile effort to soften it. Humiliated in front of the entire household by a weapon that would not yield to any of them, as the suitors grew frustrated and began quietly discussing postponing the contest to another day rather than admit total failure, the disguised beggar spoke up from his seat near the doorway, asking humbly whether he too might be permitted to try his hand at the bow. That provoked a rage and mockery from the suitors, particularly Antinous, who accused the ragged old stranger of drunken foolishness, and threatened him with violence, even state. Hearing the exchange, insisted that the stranger be given his fair chance like any other man present, arguing that it cost the suitors nothing to allow it, and Telemachus, seizing the moment to assert his own authority in front of the assembled crowd, ordered his mother back to her private chambers under the pretense that the bow was men's business, a command that startled Penelope with its new firmness. But once she obeyed without argument, retreating upstairs, unaware that she was, in that moment, walking away from the very last hours of the life she had known for 20 years. Alone among men who still believed him nothing more than a beggar, Odysseus took up his own great bow for the first time in 2 decades, turning it over in his hands to check it for damage effortlessly, unnoticeably, as a master craftsman inspecting his own tool, a detail that unsettled a few of the suitors watching closely, though none of them yet understood why. Then, with a single fluid motion that required no warming over any fire, he strung the bow that no other man in that hall had been able to bend, even slightly, plucked the string once to test its pitch, like a musician testing a lyre, and, without rising from his seat, fired a single arrow clean through the aligned handle holes of all 12 axes in a row, the exact feat only Odysseus himself had ever accomplished. In the stunned silence that followed, Telemachus moved quickly to his father's side and armed himself, and Odysseus rose from his seat, threw off the last disguise of rags and figs and false age, and stood revealed at last as the king of Ithaca, home after 20 years, aiming his second arrow not at any target of wood, but directly at Antinous, who was raising a golden cup to his lips at that very instant, and never lifted down. The hall erupted into chaos as the suitors realized too late that at every weapon had been quietly removed from the walls in the days before, exactly as Odysseus had arranged with Athena's help, leaving them defenseless against a king, a prince, and 2 loyal harmsmen who had armed themselves and now moved to seal every exit from the hall. Part 13, Reckoning. What followed was neither quick nor merciful. Some of the suitors begged for their lives, offering to repay everything they had eaten and stolen many times over. But Odysseus refused every plea, declaring that 20 years of stolen honor and threatened murder against his own son could not be repaid with gold. And the fighting that great hall over the following hours claimed the life of every suitor who had courted his wife and plundered his household. More than 100 men in total, cut down by bow, spear, sword until the floor of the hall ran with blood, and the feast tables that had once groaned under stolen food lay overturned and broken. Even the goatherd Melanthius, captured attempting to smuggle weapons to the suitors from a hidden storeroom, met a brutal end at the hands of Odysseus's loyal men, punished for a betrayal that struck the returning king as a deeper treachery even than the suitors' own greed. Since Melanthius had grown up within the household and had known exactly whom he was betraying, Odysseus ordered the disloyal serving women who had taken suitors as lovers during his long absence to be gathered, and, after being made to clear the blood and bodies from the hall themselves, executed as well. A harsh judgment by any modern measure, though one Odysseus considered entirely just, given the ancient laws of a household's honor that his own era lived by, and the punishment fell hardest on those who had actively mocked Penelope and conspired against Telemachus, rather than those who had merely served under difficult and frightening circumstances. When the hall finally fell silent, the old nurse Euryclea climbed to the upper chambers to wake Penelope, who had somehow slept through the entire battle, exhausted from years of sleepless grief, and told her that the beggar who had strung the bow was in fact her husband, returned homes. And standing that very moment in the great hall below, Penelope descended the stairs with fierce, disciplined caution rather than immediate joy, unwilling to be fooled by any trick or God's disguise. After 20 years of hoping and being disappointed, and she sat across from the blood-stirred stranger claiming to be her husband, studying his ace, the firelight without a word, offering no embrace and no easy welcome, a hesitation that frustrated even Telemachus, who scolded his mother for her coldness toward a father he himself had already accepted, without doubt. Odysseus, far from angry, understood it exactly what she was doing, recognizing in her caution the very same quality of careful, patient cunning that had first made him fall in love with her decades before, and rather than demand her trust, he simply waited, bathed, changed his clothes, restored his true appearance fully, giving Penelope every chance to look at him clearly before deciding anything at all. Finally, Penelope set a quiet test of her own, ordering her old nurse to move the bed out of their marriage chamber and make it up for the stranger to sleep in that night. A request that provoked an immediate and furious reaction from Odysseus, who protested that no one could move that bed, since he had built it himself many years earlier around the trunk of a living olive tree still rooted in the ground, carving the bedpost directly from the trunk itself, so that the bed could never be relocated without destroying it entirely, a secret known only to the two of them and one trusted servant. The moment he spoke the words, Penelope's composure finally broke, and she ran to embrace her husband at last, weeping with a relief 20 years in the making. Certain now beyond any doubt, that the man before her was truly Odysseus, since only he could have known the secret of the bed rooted in living wood, unmovably and unchanged through every year of his long absence, exactly as their marriage itself, tested and strained nearly to breaking, had somehow also remained. Part 14, Unending, that was not yet unending. The following morning, Odysseus traveled out to the countryside to see his father, Laertes, and Phaunion the old man, exactly as the ghost of his mother had described years earlier in the underworld, dressed in rags, working the soil of his own orchard with his own hands, having abandoned every comfort of the palace out of grief, for a son had been believed lost forever. Odysseus tested him first with another invented story, unable to break the habit of caution even here. But the sight of his father's genuine, broken sorrow finally moved him to reveal himself directly, and he offered proof beyond words alone, showing Laertes the exact scar from the boar's tusk and naming, one by one, every fruit tree in the orchard that his father had given him to plant as a small boy, a memory only the two of them shared. Laertes, overwhelmed, could barely believe his fortune, restored at last to a son he had mourned as dead for 20 years. But peace did not arrive easily, even now. Word of the suitors' slaughter spread quickly in Ithaca, and the grieving families of the families of the dead men gathered in fury, arming themselves and marching toward Laertes' farm to avenge their sons and brothers, certain that Odysseus deserved dread death for the killing of so many prominent young noblemen at once, whatever provocation he claimed. A small band of men, Odysseus, Telemachus, Laertes himself in one final burst of youthful vigor granted by Athena, and their loyal heartsmen, stood together to face an armed crowd that vastly outnumbered them. And for one final, dangerous moment, it seemed as though Odysseus' homecoming might end, not in peace, but in a fresh war among his own people, the 20 years of absences and violence finally only about to consume the very home he had fought so hard to reclaim. It was Athena, appearing once more in her own true form, before the assembled armies of Ithaca, who finally ended the standoff, commanding both sides to lay down their weapons and accept a lasting peace between the returned king and the families of the men he had killed, a peace sealed by divine authority that no mortal present Daruto refused. The bloodstained there, on the edge of Lartis orchard, and Ithaca set at last into an uneasy but genuine calm after 20 years of a war that had first taken its king away, and a decade more of suffering that had nearly cost him everything on the long road back. And yet, even now, standing restored beside his wife, his son, and his aging father, in the home he had crossed monsters and gods and the entire breadth of the known sea to reach, Odysseus carried with him a promise not yet fulfilled. Somewhere in his memory lived the words Tiresias had spoken to him in the land of the dead, a final journey still owed to the god who hunted him across every mile of open water, a command to leave Ithaca once more, alone, carrying an oar across his shoulder inland, walking until he found and people so far removed from the sea that they would look upon that oar and ask him why he carried a strange wooden winnowing fan for grain, and there, in that unknown country he had not yet seen and could not yet imagine, he was to plant it in the earth and make his peace. At last, with Poseidon, whether that final journey would demand of him the same cunning and endurance that had carried him past the Cyclops, past the Sirens, past the jaws of Scylla, and the hunger of Charybdis, or whether the god's fury had finally been spent entirely only on the wreck of his last every man who had sailed beside him. No one in that quiet, blood-scarred hall on Ithaca could yet say. The war was over. The house was his again. But the sea, it seemed, was never quite finished with Odysseus, and somewhere beyond the horizon, one final road still waited for him to walk it. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment.